Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the May 2025 edition of the Southeast Monthly Climate Webinar, where we talk about the climate and special topics pertaining to the Southeast region. My name is Chris Furman. I'm the Deputy Director of the Southeast Regional Climate Center, and I'll be giving a climate overview of the past month. We can go to the next slide. And I'm also going to be presenting the agricultural impacts update for, oh, we can go back. One more. There we go. So I'll also be presenting the agricultural impacts update for Pam Knox, who unfortunately is unable to. Oh, there we go. Okay, sorry about that. I'll also be presenting the agricultural impacts update for Pam Knox, who unfortunately is unable to join us today. We also have Shelby Saxon from the Southeast River Forecast Center, who will provide a water resources update. And joining us this month, we have two guest presenters. First, Dave Zierden from Florida State University and the Florida State climatologist, who will give a special update on drought conditions in Florida. And we have Michael Gavazzi from the USDA's Southeast Climate Hub, who will be discussing hurricane preparation and recovery for producers in the Southeast. Obviously, a very timely topic as we head into hurricane season. So again, thank you all for joining us this morning. Just a reminder, type those questions and comments into the question box at any time, and they'll be answered at the end. Also, a recap email of this webinar will be sent out with a YouTube link to the recording in the next day or so. All right, so let's get started with an overview of the climate. Next slide, please. All right, so over the past month, we saw above average temperatures across much of the Southeast. The greatest departures were found across southern and eastern portions of the region, where many locations were 3 to 4 degrees above average, with some places running 5 to 6 degrees above average. For the second straight month, temperatures have been running closer to average and actually even a bit below average across parts of the Caribbean. In fact, San Juan is on track to record its second straight month with a mean temperature below average. That's kind of remarkable given that the last time San Juan saw a below average month prior to last month was 2 years ago. Now, that said, San Juan did record its first heat advisory of the year just last week, with a wet bulb globe temperature reaching black flag for 3 hours this past Tuesday. So the heat season has officially started in the region. Okay, next slide. So in terms of precipitation, it's been a very wet month across much of the Southeast, especially across parts of Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina, and even across parts of the Caribbean. A notable exception, though, is the Florida Peninsula, and Dave will cover that in more detail in his presentation. Okay, next slide. So one of the more significant rainfall events occurred on May the 12th as a low pressure system, one of many throughout the month, tracked across the region. The heaviest rain occurred in eastern portions of Georgia and South Carolina, where several locations recorded over 3 inches of rain. Some of the heaviest amounts were found near Statesboro, Georgia, including the town of Brooklet, which recorded its fourth wettest day in a record going back 100 years. And the nearby Metter Regional Airport, which recorded over 7.5 inches of rain, including over 2 inches in just 1 hour. Okay, next slide. If we look at the month-to-date temperature rankings there on the left, we see that several stations across Florida, as well as some coastal locations in the Carolinas, are on track to record one of their warmest Mays on record, with Cape Hatteras currently on track to record its warmest May in a record extending over 150 years. On the right, we see that the warmth of the past few months has put many locations on track to record one of their warmest springs on record, including places like Greensboro, Asheville, Nashville, Tennessee, Columbia, Athens, Atlanta, and Charleston, while places like Washington, D.C., Norfolk, Raleigh, Charlotte, and Wilmington are on track to break or tie their record for warmest spring. Okay, next slide. Okay, looking at precipitation, we see that wetter than average conditions have prevailed across much of the region this month. Many locations are on track to record a top 10 wettest May, with some places like Danville, Virginia, Chattanooga, Huntsville, Columbia, and Orlando on track to record one of their top 5 wettest Mays on record. Seasonally, there are several locations across parts of Tennessee and Alabama, and a few others scattered across the region, that are on track to record one of their top 5 wettest springs on record. Multiple locations in the Caribbean are also on track to record their wettest spring on record, including Bonito on the island of Puerto Rico, which has recorded nearly 2.5 times its expected seasonal amount, and Truman Field on the island of St. Thomas, which has recorded more than double its expected amount for spring. In contrast, several stations in Florida have recorded less than half of their expected totals this spring, which is already the driest part of the year, with Vero Beach and Melbourne on track to record one of their 10 driest springs on record with less than a third of their expected seasonal amounts. Okay, next slide. So we can see the impact that these precipitation patterns have had on the drought monitor. The biggest improvements have been observed across interior portions of the Carolinas and Virginia, where areas of moderate and severe drought have been removed, though some dryness does remain in places. Drought also persists along the immediate coast and in extreme northern Virginia. On the other hand, drought has expanded and intensified across much of the Florida Peninsula, and Dave will go into more detail on that here in a few minutes. In terms of the Caribbean, Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands remain drought-free. In fact, last week marked 56 consecutive weeks without any drought in Puerto Rico, going back to April of last year. And this actually marks the longest such stretch in the region in over 6 years. Okay, so for the third straight month, we've seen a pretty active pattern of severe weather, not just across the Southeast, but across even the Great Plains and the Midwest. Nationally, the number of local storm reports for tornadoes since the beginning of the year ranks second since 2010, only behind the extraordinary year of 2011. So far this month, there have been 41 confirmed tornadoes in the Southeast, which is about 4 times the expected number for May. About half of these tornadoes occurred during last week's outbreak, especially across parts of Alabama and Tennessee. One of these was an EF2 that prompted a tornado emergency as it approached the Huntsville area. Fortunately, no fatalities were reported, though there were some minor injuries as well as extensive tree damage and moderate structural damage to homes. Looking at ENSO, we see that neutral conditions continue in the equatorial Pacific. The current outlook and multi-model ensemble show these conditions continuing through the summer and into the early autumn, with some hints, though, of a possible return to La Niña this winter and even a small chance of El Nino, though we should say there's much uncertainty in the forecast at these timescales. Currently, the most likely scenario, according to CPC, is a continuation of ENSO neutral through the upcoming winter, but the chances of either La Niña or El Nino are increasing, so we'll need to keep an eye on this over the coming months. Okay, next slide. All right, so last week, NOAA released its initial forecast for the upcoming Atlantic hurricane season, which officially begins this Sunday. Specifically, the Climate Prediction Center places the probability of an above-average season at 60% and is forecasting between 13 and 19 named storms, 6 to 10 of which are expected to become hurricanes, including 3 to 5 major hurricanes. Those are Category 3 and above. Similar to last season, warmer than normal sea surface temperatures and an above-average West African monsoon are expected to contribute to an active season this year. There's also the expectation of weaker wind shear in the main areas of development, though the absence of La Niña this season and the persistence of ENSO neutral may temper the forecast just a bit compared to last year, though the expectation is still for a more active than average year. More information on NOAA's forecast, including enhanced communication and forecast tools for the upcoming season, can be found at the link there at the bottom of the slide. I should also mention we'll be discussing NOAA's forecast on next month's webinar, so stay tuned to that for more details. All right, so looking at the outlook. So the seasonal outlook for summer from the CPC indicates above average temperatures across the entire region, with above average precipitation just about everywhere except for the far western portion of the region. If we go to the next slide, And look across the Caribbean, we see the seasonal outlooks are advertising above average temperatures and near average precipitation across the region over the next few months. Next slide, please. And the seasonal drought outlook closely mirrors these projections, with drought removal expected across Florida, which, as we know, is entering its wet season, and eastern portions of the Carolinas. Improvements are also expected across northern Virginia, while the Caribbean is expected to remain free of drought over the next several months. Now, I should say, as we saw just last summer, the seesaw between dry and wet periods, especially if they're punctuated by maybe multiple tropical cyclones, can have a significant effect on water management and agriculture in the region. So we need to be vigilant and prepared regardless of the outlook. Okay, next slide. All right, so looking more short term, as we look out to next week, we see the temperatures are expected to be near average across much of the region, with below average temperatures possible across the western parts of the western portion of the region. Much of Florida, though, looks to be warm and wet, while drier than average conditions are expected across the northern tier of the southeast. If we go to the next slide. There we go. Looking out to late next week and next weekend, we see warm and generally wet conditions across much of the region. And next slide. There we go. As we get into mid-June, we see equal chances of above and below average temperatures with a continuation of above average precipitation. All right, next slide. Should be the summary. Yep, there's the summary for you to look over after the webinar. Also want to acknowledge, as always, our service climatologist, William Schmitz, who helps prepare a lot of this material every month. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dave Zierden for more details on the situation in Florida.
Okay, thank you very much, Chris, for the comprehensive overview of the greater Southeast and what we've experienced recently and expect to see in the climate. I'm going to focus more on the drought conditions that have developed over the state of Florida, some of the impacts, and just some of the nuts and bolts of how we monitor and assess drought here in the state. So we can go ahead and start with the next slide. I'd like to take a little bit of time to explain about a product we all rely on, the U.S. Drought Monitor. It was begun in year 2000 as a joint product with the National Drought Mitigation Center, USDA, and NOAA. And it's unique in that it relies on an objective analysis of dozens of different indicators, from rainfall, drought indices, satellite and radar products, but it also incorporates subjective judgment from both the national author and from a whole network of local experts. Here in the Southeast, most or all of the states have developed a kind of well-defined drought monitoring and assessment group that discusses amongst themselves each week and then gives a unified consensus recommendation to the national drought author. One thing I'd like to point out is this product has changed over the last 25 years. You see, back in 2000, regions of the country were more of a broad brush approach. We're now, with many more high resolution indicators and products, and also a much more well-developed network of local experts, we now show a lot more detail and fine-grained differentiation over all parts of the country. And you see that over on the right with the drought monitor from just a week or two ago. I'd also like to call your attention to the bottom. This is a time series for the state of Florida of the percent area covered by the different categories of drought. And you see very severe widespread drought in year 2000 and 2001. Again, 2011 and 2012, both of these associated with multi-year La Niña events in the Pacific Ocean. But since 2012 or 13, we've largely avoided widespread or persistent drought in the state of Florida. By some accounts, what we're experiencing now is the worst, especially in South Florida, since 2012. So this graph kind of shows that. So we can go to the next slide. I just want to talk about some of the challenges of monitoring and assessing drought in Florida. Uh, Chris talked about the Florida dry season, which runs basically from mid-October through mid-May and mostly affects the peninsula of Florida. Uh, Usually we get 2 to 3 inches of rainfall per month during those months, as opposed to 8 inches or more during the summer months. So really well-defined dry season. So it's often difficult to differentiate between the normal seasonal dryness and true drought. Uh, if you're only averaging 2 to 3 inches of rainfall a month and you only get half of that, are the impacts that much different than just a normal dry season? That's something we always struggle with. And a topic that's been very relevant to NIDIS in the past few years is flash drought or rapidly developing drought. And being able to identify and react quickly to these episodes of flash drought is always a challenge. And here in Florida, especially South Florida, the hydrology is very managed and interconnected. So we look a lot at water levels rather than where the rainfall may or may not have actually fallen. And it's been a learning experience over the years to be able to do that. And there's always conflicting recommendations from the different group members that we hash out among ourselves. But we can go to the next slide and start looking at current conditions. Uh, Chris covered this very well. In addition to dry conditions, lack of rainfall, we've also had unusually hot temperatures over the last month or more. On the left shows average daytime high temperatures over the last 30 days, and we see almost every station in Florida is either in the upper 80s or even low 90s average for the last 30 days. And over on the right gives the historical rankings. Every one of the stations colored that dark red is in the top 5 all time for temperature over the last 30 days. Uh, and you see a sprinkling of number ones around the Jacksonville, Daytona Beach area, where they are experiencing their driest 30-day, or I'm sorry, hottest 30-day period on record. So this has exacerbated the drought and lack of rainfall. So we'll go to the next slide. And Chris covered this pretty well, but let's look at the rainfall graphic on the right, the NEXRAD estimates. This was from a stubborn low pressure system 2 weeks ago that produced a multi-day rainfall event and really good coverage of 2 to 3 inches over most of the state. Some pockets of 5 to 6 inches around Melbourne, uh, South Central Florida, the Florida Panhandle. So this was very beneficial. The problem was it was sandwiched between 2 weeks of no rainfall and hot temperatures prior, and it was followed by another 2 weeks of little rainfall and no temperatures. So this event was not as impactful as it could have been. But over on the left, I show the same type graphic for the past 7 days. And here we see where the normal afternoon thunder shower activity has really started to kick in along the eastern side of the state. Uh, so 2 weeks ago, I wouldn't call it the beginning of the rainy season, but the past week, it looks like the rainy season is really starting to kick in and will help alleviate some of the drought issues. So we'll go to the next slide. Yeah, so let's start talking about impacts. These are drought drought reports from the climate monitoring report tool from the National Drought Mitigation Center. And you see the reports are clustered where the drought is mostly designated. Uh, so we're doing a good job designating the state the correct way to align with the impacts. Majority of these impacts are from the pasture and cattle industry It's one of the leading agricultural commodities here in the state and probably covers the most agricultural land in the state. And the reports are all the same. The fields are suffering, little production so far from the pastures, the need for feeding some supplemental hay, and also the watering ponds on these ranches are drying up, and so keeping the cattle watered is a big issue. And on the bottom, you can see the majority of these reports were issued the last week of April. Since we had a couple of rounds of rainfall in May, the number of reports have greatly declined. So we'll go to the next slide and talk about another impact, and that is on our wildfire season. Uh, Corresponding to the Florida dry season, the wildfire threat starts to ramp up in January through March and usually reaches a peak in April and early May when temperatures really start to rise, but the rainy season has not kicked in. And this year is no different. Here in the state of Florida, on the left, we rely heavily on the Keach-Byram Drought Index. It's really a good indicator, especially at this time of year, of the underlying drought conditions and fuel moisture, topsoil moisture. Uh, and here you see that there's still very high values along the southwest coast of Florida, uh, 550 to 600, which indicates a fairly high wildfire potential. And over on the right, you see there are county-wide outdoor burn bans in place from the Florida Forest Service uh, along the southwest coast of Florida, even into interior southwest Florida. These burn bans are still in place. And on the bottom right, it just shows a map of the current wildfires that they are monitoring across the state. So we'll go to the next slide. And now let's talk about the hydrology side of the current drought. Uh, Down in South Florida, the water resources are very heavily managed, and kind of the kingpin to all that is the Lake Okeechobee, which is managed by the Army Corps of Engineers. Uh, but here it shows the lake levels, which are down to 10.95 feet today, I believe. But as you see in the blue, it's almost down to the water shortage management criteria where a whole new set of management plans comes into play. And you also notice that this is historically the time of year when lake levels are the lowest. And that's partly because of the dry season, but also the Army Corps manages it so it has room to absorb heavy rains from the rainy season or possible tropical cyclones as we later in the summer. Uh, what I don't show is water levels in the Everglades National Park and Big Cypress National Park are very low right now. Surface waters are drying up. Uh, in a lot of areas, it's preventing airboat access and the normal recreation that goes on and tourism that rely on that. Uh, Also, with the wildfire concerns and threat, a few weeks ago on two different occasions, US Highway 1 was shut down due to smoke and brush fires. And that's critical because it is the only inlet and outlet of traffic from the mainland Florida into the Florida Keys. So we'll go to the next slide now. This is kind of my summary slide, but also a shameless plug. We have started again creating weekly infographics that give a little more information than is available on the U.S. Drought Monitor. Uh, Backed by popular demand, the Florida Department of Emergency Management really loves these infographics to present in their biweekly weather and drought and climate updates. So we'll be putting these out weekly. You can find them on our website, climatecenter.fsu.edu. And with that, I'll go ahead and pass it along to Shelby Saxon with the National Weather Service Southeast River Forecast Center for the hydrologic outlook.
Thanks, David. And Eleanor, we can go to the next slide. And so, as Chris said, we've seen a few rain events over the month of May. And so that has been a turnaround in our 28-day average stream flows. And so now we're seeing those at normal and above normal across the Southeast. Alabama continues to be favored for rain accumulation as the systems are setting up. And so there we're seeing flows up into the 90th percentile compared to their historical flows for this time of the year. And we can go to the next slide and we'll discuss that a little bit more and flows across our other Southeast states. And so Alabama, Georgia, and Florida runoff declined quickly in April. The rain was infrequent, and but that really changed in May. And so these stalled frontal boundaries have led to a lot of rebound across the Southeast. Georgia has been able to maintain normal runoff because of the systems, and Florida did not fall further into the below normal. And we just heard from David about how that and the temperatures kind of played out. But this is the first positive trend in Florida since February. And so we are looking for that rainfall season to kind of start to kick in, as David said. And so we can go to the next slide where we'll talk about the Carolinas and Virginia. And so in South Carolina and North Carolina, runoff was also in a steady decline since about mid February. And so February was when we saw some snow and good rain events, but that kind of stopped. And in South Carolina, the dryness was the story statewide since the end of 2024. And so for the first time this year, we're seeing runoff in the normal range and comparable to amounts from last May. And so then in North Carolina, we were consistently receiving rainfall in certain parts of the state. And so runoff was steadily staying in that area of slightly below normal to normal. And with the May rainfall, we have kind of really had a big uptick into the normal category there. Virginia, things have also been infrequent like they were in North Carolina. And so rainfall was occurring, but kind of infrequent in location and amounts. And so that rebound there from the May setup has been significant in Virginia. On the next slide, we have our current river conditions. And so that current stall boundary over the southeast is providing substantial amounts of rain to parts of some states. In Florida or in Alabama, we've seen 4.5 inches in some places. Also along the northwestern parts of Georgia, those amounts have been about the same. But as we move closer to the coast of North Carolina, we're only about at a 1/4 inch so far, but that front is expected to stay around for a little while longer, and so amounts in North Carolina will start to accumulate over the next few days. And so, with that ongoing rainfall as well as rainfall from previous weeks, we do have some flooding going on. And that flooding is mostly in the action to minor flood stage. And if it's not already occurring, we do have it forecast to occur. And so, it being week 22 of the year, it is typical that we see minor floods. And so, the minor flooding is a typical pattern over the next few weeks, and then we'll transition into more of a tropical. And later in the year, we may start to see increasing of moderate floods. And so, we can go to the next slide where we specifically look at our South Florida climatology. And the rainfall season, as we said, has not quite kicked in there. And so minor river flooding is possible, but unlikely at this time. And over the next few weeks, we'll start to maybe see that become more common as rain starts to reach the area. And so we'll go to the final slide that I'll discuss today. And this is our outlook for the late spring and early summer in terms of river flooding. With the convective rainfall being our dominant weather pattern and competition for water resources increasing as the temperatures get warmer throughout the spring and summer, we do expect normal risk for river flooding. On the next slide, I have my summary that you can read later, as well as my contact information, and I'll hand it off to Chris to discuss agriculture.
All right, great. Thank you, Shelby. Again, Pam was unfortunately unable to present this month, but she did put some slides together for us, and so I'll be walking us quickly through how recent weather conditions have impacted agriculture in the Southeast. So we'll go on to the next slide. And let's start with how things are looking in the fields. Most corn is already planted and growing quickly, which is great. Peanuts and cotton, though, are a bit behind, but over half those acres have been planted. For cotton, one of the issues we've seen is seedling disease, which can become a problem when the soils get too wet, which has been the case in many places. Georgia peaches, though, are thriving. Looks like we're in for a bumper crop, which is great. Blueberries are mostly doing well, though some areas are having a little trouble with the weather. On the left, we see an example of mummyberry, which is a fungal disease that's been reported recently in some places. The Vidalia onion season is nearly done with most of the harvest in, and hay production is underway with about half of the farmers having made their first cut. Looking at specific states, Alabama is lagging a bit behind, mainly because they've just had more rainy days, which makes it hard to get into the fields. And for wheat, most of it has already headed, which is a key growth stage for the crop and indicates that it's progressing well. If you're interested in regular updates, the USDA's NAS is a great place to check out and see how things are progressing in your area. All right, so turning to soil conditions, the data here on these maps show that the 100 centimeter soil moisture, that's down about 3 feet, is running dry in parts of southwest Georgia, some of the west coast of Florida, and sections of the Carolinas, but elsewhere is looking pretty good. Meanwhile, soil temperatures in the bottom 4 or 5 inches are warmer than normal across much of the region, which can have kind of mixed effects. Some plant diseases become sort of less common when soils are warm, but others like root rot and seedling blight can thrive. So it's kind of a balancing act. Pam's provided some links there on the slide for you if you ever want to dig deeper into the current soil and hydrology maps. All right, so shifting to, looks like we're a slide ahead. Let's go back one. Can we go back one slide? Oh, there we go. So our regional mesonets, like the ones we have in Georgia and North Carolina, give us a good picture of soil temperatures at a finer scale. These temperatures shown here are from early in the morning and still show above average warmth. Again, this affects which plant diseases might show up and how fast crops get going after they're planted. It's also another reason why, and we emphasize this a lot, why local data are so important, as conditions can vary a lot from county to county. Okay, next slide. All right, so looking at growing degree days, we see the Southeast is well above average in many places, not surprising there, where things are heating up actually a bit faster than they were this time last year. This is helping crops get a bit ahead of schedule, and that can be good up to a point, but it also means farmers have to adjust their management plans, especially if we see rainfall patterns change, and of course if pests or diseases start showing up earlier as well. All right, so next slide. This should be the summary slide. It is. So there's Pam's summary slide for you to look at later. And now I'm very pleased to introduce Michael Gavazzi from USDA's Southeast Climate Hub. He's going to be driving his slides here, and he'll be discussing hurricane preparation and recovery for producers in the Southeast. So Michael, the floor is yours. And again, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Chris. And good afternoon, everyone. I appreciate you coming to this talk. I'm Michael Gavazzi. I'm a natural resource specialist for the USDA Southeast Climate Hub. We're part of the Forest Service's Southern Research Station Eastern Threat Center. The Climate Hubs work with producers and technical service providers to help build resilience to disturbance, such as drought, hurricane, insect outbreaks, to reduce risk and recover more quickly from the impacts from these threats. And as a follow-up to Hurricane Preparedness Week earlier in the month, I'll be talking about hurricane preparation and recovery for working land managers, those who manage forests, farms, and livestock, as well as the technical service providers that work with them. I'm going to guess that most of y'all are familiar with this map. These are pretty commonly used just to show the impact from different disturbances in the U.S. and in the Southeast. It's pretty common to see a lot of these little hurricane uh, images here. And 2020 was a particularly bad year with several billion-dollar hurricane events. So that's, we have other impacts here in the Southeast, but hurricanes can be some of the most destructive that we have to deal with, and it's difficult for producers to assess their risk. And that's, one of the components of this hurricane preparedness is assessing that risk. But it's hard, see from these different hurricanes that are listed here, um, the different hurricane categories. You expect to see Katrina, Helene will probably make it on here once the total numbers are tallied. But you expect to see 3, 4s, and 5s, kind of the major hurricane categories. But then at the bottom, you see, Florence, this Category 1 storm in 2021 that, you know, I want to say only had about a $30 billion overall cost, but the ag losses were exceeded those of the other hurricanes. And part of it, the timing when it came during, I think it was September, so it was kind of late in the season where a lot of products haven't been harvested. It was slow moving, excessive rainfall that also resulted in extensive flooding. And that's what's common with a lot of hurricanes that we're seeing lately. They're slower moving, bringing a lot of rain and a lot of flooding with them, along with the winds that are typical with hurricane impacts. Some of the impacts you see, you have the wind damage, storm surge is common, on the coast, there's saltwater intrusion that's becoming more and more of an issue for farmers to deal with. And oftentimes it's not chronic, it can be washed away with the rain, but other times, it stays on the soil and impacts the land. You also have the flooding that comes along with the precipitation. A lot of the damages they see, local regional infrastructure issues, the agricultural losses, which are oftentimes what you hear about, crops, livestock, and forests. Also the loss of life and property, which is really something that important and try to plan for and minimize. There's also the mental and physical health, which is really hard on farmers each year dealing with many disturbances and hurricanes, uh, no more, no less. And then food security and costs that come along with the disruption with the infrastructure. When we're looking at risk, these are these spaghetti plots. If this one's centered on South Carolina, um, this is all the hurricanes that have come within, I think, 60 miles of the point that I selected. So there's some that didn't make direct contact. So these numbers are a little higher than you may be expecting or that I'll actually mention in a few minutes. But in this example, just looking at the hurricanes category 1 to 5 on the left, there's about 66 of those. But when you include tropical storms and depressions in this time range, and this is, I believe it's from 1900, you see, there's 237 now, all storms. So it's not just the hurricanes, but these other tropical storms that also have a significant impact and trying to plan for. Again, just real quick, looking at, the overall average. I know in the previous slide you saw they're expecting, I think every year recently we've expected, 6 or more hurricanes to impact the Southeast. And just looking at the historical average, from 1900. It's about 2 per year in the Southeast, but as everybody knows, those numbers do seem like they've been increasing of late. If you're in Florida, obviously you know about hurricanes. You can expect to see one about once every 1 to 2 years, and you see from the list down to Virginia, it's a lot less frequent. This map is commonly used by FEMA to show the risk of hurricanes, and it does a pretty good job. Again, you can give you an idea of your county and what your risk is, but it's also can be misleading. In 2023, Hurricane Idalia came through as a Category 3 storm, and you can see on the map how it hit areas that if you were living there, you would think, I have a pretty low risk of hurricane impact. So it's really hard to assess risk. So the best thing to do for planning for emergencies is to have a plan in place, and we're going to talk about that in just a second. And so in 2018, we had a workshop with subject matter experts, extension agents, NRCS field staff, and some farmers in Gainesville, Florida, to talk about hurricane prep and recovery. And really insightful. It was kind of the state of the science, what people were doing, what they needed. And what we realized, a lot of great information already out there. It just was in different places. It might be in a blog post, it might be in an old extension article, or maybe even in a research paper that hasn't been synthesized for general consumption yet. So we had this workshop and we realized we needed to kind of consolidate the information that was out there into one guide for the different commodities. So we reached out to subject matter experts in the Southeast, and 55 authors came forward across 10 universities and agencies, and we were able to produce 23 different commodity guides that cover 25 commodities. So tomato, pepper, and eggplant are one guide. So there's 25 commodities with 23 guides that range from livestock, aquaculture, row, and specialty crops. Um, if there's a one of these you want, these are available online. You can see from the link. Long link, you can just type in Southeast Climate Hub in a Google search or internet search, and it should be one of the top hits. If there's a guide you want, hard copies, we do have some. You can come by the office here in RTP, North Carolina, or send me an email, and I'd be happy to send you copies if we have one available. And what we did with all of the guides is they followed a similar format, and we found it kind of worked well, starting with the building resilient operation. What are those systems that need to be in place to reduce your risk? And then moving into long-term, kind of the outside of the growing season, things you can do, maintenance. And I'll go into each of these in a little more detail. Short-term, you're kind of in the cone, the forecast cone. It looks like the hurricane's going to impact you. What are some short-term things you can do? And then post-hurricane recovery, which is really important. We also have an appendix with contact information, different links to USDA and state agencies, as well as an initial site planning. And I'll start with that one as I go through the guides. And one thing we did that was really useful is we learned as people were submitting drafts of these guides. Most of us have forestry with some natural resource background, so not a lot in the ag sector. So, we didn't know all of the smaller points that may be important. Some generators, a group would send in an information about generators, say the tobacco commodity groups. And sorry, my computer just did something. So we learned, oh, this is great content, and we called it universal text. And that was text or guidance that was universal across commodities with maybe some minor modifications or changes to it to make it commodity specific. There's a lot of commonality between the guides. And at the bottom, you see the arrow going back from post-hurricane recovery back to building a resilient operation. So post recovery is the times, look at your lessons learned, look at some of the guidance in these manuals, and see what you can implement to reduce your risk moving forward. I'm going to start talking with a little bit about initial site selection. It's in one of our appendices. And this is where you're trying to looking at, what is your risk? You can assess it based on some of the other maps that I showed you previously. This is hurricane return interval map, which, it can maybe give you an idea of your risk, but you really don't know. So the best thing you can do is to plan for the impacts for a potential hurricane, just like you would with other disturbances and emergencies. Assessing your risk, just having an idea, but knowing it can happen anytime. What's your topography and your drainage? Those are really important. If you have drainage ditches, that can be helpful. If you have sandy soils that may not, won't flood as much as say a clay soil. Looking at flood risk and storm surge, depending on where you are. Are you near an electrical grid? Are you going to need one? Are there natural windbreaks that are already in place that can help reduce some of the winds from hurricanes? And also, depending if you are a livestock producer, do you have a burial site nearby, or do you have the ability to build your own burial site? And moving into the building a resilient operations section, this is, we put personal safety first in several of these, making sure there's stressed on personal as well as staff safety, and that comes back later on as well after the hurricane. But for any commodity, record keeping and documentation is going to be essential for both pre and post disturbance information, for calculating your loss. You can use this for insurance as well as for some of the recovery assistance programs that are available. Your infrastructure, again, looking at your drainage, is there road maintenance that needs to be done? These are things that, you should have a good road, you should have plans in place. These are kind of the systems we say that should be in place to maximize your resilience and reduce your risk. Should you planting cover crops that can help with sandblasting of nearby plantings, thinking about things for straps, for beehive lids, or the windbreaks different variety selection, longleaf versus loblolly pine, depending on where you are. Knowing your land and your timber basis is going to be really important for your tax benefits as well as your casualty loss if you're growing timber. You can look at other types of early or late maturing varieties. And again, you're assessing risk and kind of guessing when a hurricane may occur. And in some places that may be easier to do than others. But there's the option of doing, late maturing to more early maturing varieties to kind of get harvested before the meat of hurricane season gets here. And then having an emergency plan. This is critical. And depending on how many employees you have, it may be required by OSHA to have a hurricane or emergency plan in place. And the hurricane emergency plan is kind of, it focuses just on the hurricane aspect of it. Have an evacuation plan, food and water. If employees are going to stay on site, what is your plan to keep them safe and fed during the time? How are you going to communicate with them? Really important communicating with your employees as well as other farmers in the area or some central place that that you can meet after, say, you lose electricity. Where am I going to go? Is it the seed store? Just thinking about things beforehand, because if you've been through something as devastating as this, if you're not planned, you don't have a plan in place, it can just multiply or exacerbate the situation. If you have livestock, what is your emergency disposal plan for catastrophic loss? These are the things you need to have in place beforehand. And again, it makes dealing with the issue a lot easier as you move into it. Moving into long-term planning, this is kind of, again, making sure those systems are in place or doing some maintenance to them outside of growing season, outside of hurricane season. Awesome. Do you have infrastructure? Do you have drainage ditches? Do you need to clean out your drainage ditches? Do you have roads that need maintenance? Any kind of employee training? This is kind of thing where you can think about chainsaws. One thing we heard a lot about from folks was losing access to their farms. They evacuated and tried to come back, and they couldn't get back in because the roads were covered with downed trees and debris, or they were stranded on their farm because the roads were blocked. And have a plan in place. Some the guides call for, if there's water nearby, have a canoe, something that you may be able to use to get somewhere off your land if it floods frequently. Which again, having these things thought through and written down, and then communicated throughout the year. This is the time to reassess your emergency plan to make sure your contacts are current and your information is up to date. And short-term preparedness now is when you're starting to be in that forecast cone. So you're pretty, higher certainty that you're going to have some sort of impact from the storm. And this is about 1 to 7 day. I think for hurricanes, at least we usually can we have some lead time about them. They do change direction, but you usually have some indication when it's coming toward you, and gives you time to put some of these systems into place in your plan. Um, so, you can get some supplies if you need them. This is waiting till the last minute is grocery stores and elsewhere the supplies go quickly. So these are the things you want to have before you're really in this cone of this forecasted cone if you can. And if you have fencing for your livestock, this is where you have harvest considerations. Can you harvest before the storm gets here? Or should you harvest? Documenting everything is super important. If you have, talk about that on the next slide, and safety too, maybe stressing safety. But we didn't talk about drones much. That's often mentioned earlier in the guides for inventorying. They're really popular and a good way to kind of take pictures and get a pre-hurricane assessment of your land. But again, they're great for coming out after the storm. We stress here again, personal health and safety first for you and the people that work with you on the farm, and documenting everything before you clean up. Don't start cleaning up. Don't really being safe around electricity and taking stock of personal health first, and then documenting and then cleaning up after you've spoken to your insurance adjuster or some other groups that you may be working with on your farm. And then you get into assessing the damage, and you're getting access to some of the disaster and recovery assistance programs that are available. Again, so I said, contact your insurance adjuster. With the USDA Disaster Resource Center, it's a really great resource to learn about different programs that are available, not just post disturbance, but also pre-disturbance. But if you're in a hurricane, you can go to the farmers.gov recover site, and they've got a really nice disaster assistance discovery tool. It's a 5-step process, kind of the what, when, where, to identify disaster assistance programs that might meet your business needs. So it's really easy to get through, and at the end, it'll tell you about programs that are available. It's also important to check back periodically because some programs that need approval of Congress or the president can take some time to get approval. So you want to stay connected to your USDA service centers and other folks that can keep you aware of when different programs are available and what you qualify for. Real quickly, I'll just go over a few of these, recovery assistance. There's several out of the Farm Service Agency as well as the Natural Resource Conservation Service, and there's some that kind of overlap with each other. There's a few listed here depending on your commodity. There's some really great fact sheets they have that can give you the quick answer of whether or not your situation qualifies for this assistance. A couple of them, like the Emergency Forest Restoration Program, it's funding for emergency measures to restore forest land damaged by natural disasters, debris removal, site prep, planting assistance. So there's a lot to help you get back on your feet and get that back in timber again. Emergency Watershed Protection Program, it's funding and assistance to relieve imminent threats that impair a watershed, such as drainage and erosion, so really applicable here. And then the EQUIP program, the Environmental Quality Incentives Program. It's a year-round program, and so it's not just waiting for a disaster to occur. It can be some preemptive actions to improve water and air quality, conserve water, improve soil health, decrease soil erosion and sediment, and mitigate against drought and increasing weather vulnerability. And you can also get guidance on claiming a casualty loss. I'll wrap up here, and there's a really nice short, I guess, presentation, if you will, the 5-minute version of what I just gave. That if you missed anything or you want to share, I think this does a good job of going into some of the details that I covered, as well as maybe a few others. And that's on our website. You can find, again, just Google Southeast Climate Hub, and you'll see one of the topics, the main topics, covers hurricane prep and recovery, and you can find that there. Also, the University of Florida, and I apologize, I don't remember the professor who did this, they did a really nice multi-day webinar series for forest land managers where they use the guides as kind of the template for it. And they stay focused, obviously, like specifically on Florida resources, but a lot of the information is pretty relevant regionally. So it's a little hard to find. You can, it's on the Florida Land Steward page. There's you see where I have it circled, the Hurricane Prep and Recovery webinar, and then the Florida Land Stewards event. And they talked about moving them to YouTube, but I checked recently and they were still on the UF website. And that's all I have. I want to thank you all for listening to the presentation. I want to also mention that we're working on drought preparation and recovery guides, not quite as many commodities right now, but we have 14 that are 10 of them are really getting close to sending off to our communication shop to be published, and then hopefully adding a few more over the next few months after that. So if you check our webpage, we'll announce that when those are available. We usually, in the past, have done some outreach activities that we hope to do again, at least getting it out on Twitter or X or some social media sites that extension agents and producers may visit. So I thank you and happy to answer any questions.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Michael, for sharing all that terrific information. And also thank you to Dave and Shelby for your presentations this morning. This is Chris Furman again from the Southeast Regional Climate Center. Unfortunately, our usual MC, Elliot Wickham, is unable to join us today, so I'll be facilitating the Q&A along with Eleanor Hassenbeck from NIDIS. Before we get started, I wanted to draw your attention to some of our upcoming webinars. As I mentioned, we'll be hearing from NOAA next month on the details of the upcoming Atlantic hurricane season. And then we'll have a 2-part mini-series on drought in July and August, covering both the science as well as the outreach and monitoring aspects of drought. So be sure to mark your calendars for those. And as always, if you have any comments or questions, especially if you have any ideas for future speakers, please contact Elliot or myself. Elliot's email is there on the slide, and my email is also in my slide deck as well. So with that, we'll take a look in the chat and see if there are any questions. If you do have questions or comments for any of the speakers, please be sure to put those in the chat so we can share them. And Eleanor has also provided a lot of links here, especially from Michael's presentation, that could be useful for some of you. So be sure to check those out. I don't see any questions at the moment. Eleanor, do you see anything on your end?
No, not so far. So a good moment to get your question in the question box if you have a burning question that you want to ask one of our presenters.
Yeah, we've got about 4 or 5 minutes here until the top of the hour. So yeah, there's still time to enter a question if you have one. And of course, all our speakers have their contact information in the slide deck. So if you have questions later on, you can always reach out to any one of us. And again, that webinar recap and recording will be available, should be available here in the next few days. So be looking for that email as well. All right, I'm not seeing anything, so that.
We have a couple now.
Okay, good.
Let's see. Oh, it's a question about the hurricane webinar recordings. Yes, that link, I will respond to this person who was looking for a link to the hurricane webinar recording from the Southeast Climate Hub. I think those were the land stewards. Maybe Michael could address that more, but I think that was the land steward webinar series. But if that's something else, Michael, let us know and we'll make sure to connect that person to that webinar recording.
Yeah, I think you have it right. There's the Florida Land Stewards you have on there in the chat, and then the one above it will get you to our website that has the guides as well as the short video about the guides.
All right, I think that's all that we've got at the moment. So I will, I'm just gonna linger on here for another 30 seconds or so and see if another one comes in. So Chris, do you have any other parting thoughts or wisdom?
No, actually, I'll go ahead and say, since I didn't say at the beginning, it's wonderful to be back. As many of you know, the Regional Climate Center program had its contract renewed last month. So because it lapsed briefly, I was unable to join you all last month, but very happy to be back and look forward to hopefully continuing being a part of this webinar series moving forward. Yeah, are there any other questions, Eleanor? Anything else pop up?
Nothing so far. So I think we can say goodbye for now and have a great day, everybody.
Yep, take care, and we'll hope to see everybody next month.